Hello, welcome to the first podcast series about data. And really, this session is to just have a chat about how impact is measured across your school. And obviously, this forms a greater part of the Transform Ed vision, which is to really drive outcomes among our partner schools. And to start, let's have a think about what this session's actually going to be about then. So, is your school playing blindfolded? Now, there's a reason why I've kind of chosen that name, and that'll become apparent later on. Why are we playing blindfolded, and in fact, are we? And when I'm on about being blindfolded, really that links to data. Are we using data in a way that can truly transform outcomes, or are we using data in a way which actually is hindering our operations more than it is benefiting? So, let's make a start on what research says. And in order to talk about that, I'm going to kind of make reference really to three key aspects. So you'll be familiar with these being school leaders, but the first is going to be the Sutton Trust, and then the EEF, and then Ofsted. All of them have one thing in common, which is highlighting the importance of feedback. The more immediate the feedback, the greater the impact it has. Now, that term impact covers all manner of sins, really. We can see data going up in one aspect, but just because data improves, we assume therefore is having benefit, the maximum benefit. Whereas actually, if we think about progress in a less linear way and a more nuanced way, then perhaps we can see, fine, outcomes are improving, but are they improving in the best way that they can? Is this the most progress that they can make? And you can get evidence to support that. So really, the first part when I'm talking about feedback is reflecting upon your own data models and the way that you're asking your teachers to import data or to put data into their mark books. How do you do that? I've worked, as those of you who've met me know, in education for over a decade, all the way up from being a teacher to working for a multi-academy trust in senior offices. And one of the things that I've learned is every school does data in different ways. And some of the schools that I've worked at, you will have data input once every term, some every half term. And I think I'd like to ask why. Why do you do, and I'd like you to think about this, why do you do that data the way that you do it in terms of the input? Why do you choose that regular occurrence? Maybe it is that half term, maybe it's terminally, maybe it's something a bit more nuanced. I don't know. But the reason I'm asking you to think about why is that because you think you get enough data, or is that because you want to reduce teacher workload? Because I know teacher workload and the reduction of that is something which is a major driving focus at the moment, especially with Ofsted's new framework. So from my experience, we've always had this balance, haven't we, between wanting to get as much data as possible whilst also not wanting to make the teacher workload increase. The data that we collect has to be important and has to stand for something, which is why we go for those regular input. So you'll have one, for example, a formative or a summative at the end of every unit, but you want to make sure that it can be measured across the whole curriculum as well. And I think a lot of schools have become quite static, and I'm going to refer back to that word. I think we've become a bit archaic, perhaps, in some of the way that we're thinking. We've done it for this many years. There's no reason to change. And I would challenge you to think now, with the fact that we've got AI, and AI is being integrated with education quite a lot now, and it's not going to be long before it's in our MIS systems. And is there a way where actually we can increase the data that we get whilst reducing teacher workload? And I believe there is. I believe there's a happy balance and a medium to be had there. And really that's the journey of this podcast, of what I want to talk to you guys about. So what I'd like to think about now is an analogy. So some of the schools which I've worked at, they do things a bit differently, and maybe this analogy might help you. So I'm by no stretch of the imagination a football fanatic, so forgive me for this, but I think it really does help you see the point which I'm trying to make. So imagine you're a football coach, football manager, and you're going into a football match with any team, doesn't matter which, and you have your team talk at the beginning of the match to say, you know what, let's go, we can do really well with this. We're going to, kick the backside of this football team. Let's just get to it. However, during the match, you don't talk about data at all. So halftime comes in and you've got nothing to talk about. You don't talk about data. You don't talk about strategy. You don't talk about changing redirection, or you'll see perhaps now, interventions that you can put in place in order to make sure that the outcome changes at the end of it. There's no data analysis whatsoever until the end of that match. And some schools operate like this. So going back to the name of the podcast, Are We Playing Blindfolded? This is really the crux of it. Does your data system just have that data analysis at the end where the work has been done? Because if so, is that the best approach? So the schools where I've been in, I will do a scheme of work. Let's just say it's in spring 1, and I will do all of my work, and then at the end of it, I will put my data in to say this is what happened. Because that's basically the analogy which I've just spoken about. Can interventions be put in place? And I know what some leaders are going to say, which is, well, actually the teachers should be having their own mark book and they should be then putting data into that, and it's up to them in order to do that level of data analysis and then to make the intervention so that actually the outcome at the end is the finished article, the finished product. And I think really what I want to do is to challenge that thought, because actually from what I've just said, that seems to be an increase in teacher and school leader workload, not a decrease. Whereas actually if we can empower our MIS to do that, the teacher doesn't have to do that analysis. There are very few teachers and school leaders who I've come across who are comfortable in making really effective data insights and looking at that set of data in that Excel spreadsheet and actually saying, you know what, this is what, using that data, that database, this is the information that I can get out of it. More often than not, they will just put data in a numerical way, and from that they would just say this person isn't doing as well as they should do. But the insights aren't that deep. It doesn't take into account a range of different factors which actually they might need. To help explain that a bit further, let's just say the student's doing really well in spring 1, and then in spring 2 the grades decrease. So the teacher has tried their best on an individual level to have a look at those students who are struggling and to improve their outcomes, and to some extent that's worked. But why? Why? And that picture as to why they struggle is what that data can produce. So let's just take into account actually it might be a sequencing challenge. Ofsted's new framework, they want us to have a look at cognitive strain more than ever before. They want to make sure that teachers really understand in the sequencing part of their curriculum what is the way to reduce cognitive load and strain. And maybe that's going to be putting this module in this specific place, let's just say autumn 1, and then this module in autumn 2 or spring 1 or whatever, to try to balance that that cognitive load. And actually, going back to the example, these students were struggling perhaps because actually the cognitive load for mathematics is really high, and the students just haven't had that headspace, because they've got X amount of tests coming up in maths. They're really getting their head around these key concepts. There's too much strain, so therefore they haven't got the time and the effort to actually try to apply themselves to my subject in the same way. And that's not necessarily a conscious choice by the student. It could be subconscious. They could be feeling overwhelmed and going, oh my goodness, that's just life. That's just the nature of it. And we've all, when we've been growing up, we've had that similar experience. So to have the data can actually tell a story to Ofsted, and more importantly to ourselves, where we can navigate the strains of our curriculum as a school. And if we are telling our teachers to do that, they're not going to see the bigger picture. It's not their job to, in all fairness, because to do that would take them well beyond the remit of what they're expected to do. And I think we need to move away from these individual workbooks, which, as history has shown, I think teachers are doing and still are expected to do, and to have more of a micro level approach to our MIS system. So I would kind of go the other way, where actually individual mark books are scrapped and every single bit of data that we can possibly think about that is meaningful goes into that MIS. And on the most recent training session, I was speaking to one of the head teachers, and we kind of got across this idea about, again, going back to that football analogy, how can we make data dynamic and not static? As a school leader, I've wanted to be able to go on to the MIS, and I've wanted it to tell me, well, actually, this week has been quite a challenge. My results aren't quite as good this week as they were last week. And rather than me feeling and thinking that as previously I may have needed to, I can actually sit back and say, well, the data's supporting this. When I have a look at my starters and my plenaries and how they've been measured and the tasks which I've given students, they seem to be struggling and there's more misconceptions coming up this week. The data supports that, I can go over that. Whereas if I'm doing my own workbook, I don't think it's in that detail. I don't think teachers are doing it to that nuanced degree for them to really understand the journey, the dynamic journey which is happening, and to be able to make those real-time decisions about what needs to happen in terms of interventions to get those outcomes to where they need to be. And this isn't a big revolutionary thing. It's basically just programming the MIS to be more dynamic, to have more data of regular occurrence. And one of the best places that I used to work at was actually a college. And every single half term, we were given kind of your position within all of the subjects. And I want you to think of that as kind of a league table. Again, I'm so sorry for the football analogies, but it just makes sense. So you're given this league table, and you can see, as a school leader, all of the teams, where they are in terms of their positions. The individual subjects didn't see that. They just got an email saying, okay, so actually you're 7th, you're 6th, you're 8th. And it certainly wasn't, a punishment. No one was penalised for this. Actually, it was really good pedagogy. If my subject is doing one of the worst, I need to know that in a way where I feel comfortable to change the outcomes of that. Because as teachers, it's about being self-reflective. It's not because necessarily of everything that I do might play a part in it, but it allows me to be self-reflective and to think something isn't going right. Let's improve that whilst I still can. There's no good in sitting with a member of staff saying, you know what, your data this year wasn't very good. The year's gone. You could, let's even bring it back a bit. Your data for this term wasn't very good, or half term wasn't very, it's too late. The outcome has happened. The students have missed all of that knowledge that I could have attained. And actually, what we want is to empower our teachers to be self-critical and to say, okay, the data which I'm getting isn't as good as last term or last year or whenever. I feel empowered to make that difference. And I think having data so readily available on such a micro level, that's what's going to empower me. And when I was at that college, I got some days, some terms which were good data, some which were bad, but I always knew where I stood. Nothing was ever a surprise. And that kind of also funneled down to the students. So the students were very aware. Think about metacognition. They were aware of how they were doing in a very micro way. And I've been in schools where students will often come up and say, how am I doing? No student should ever ask, how am I doing? You should know. It's not up to me to tell you. You should know by your work, how you feel, discussions. It should never be, this is how you're doing at the moment, because that feels a lot like a parents' evening. The reason we have parents' evening is because parents necessarily don't have access to that micro level data. They need to have that conversation. Students should have access to all of the data that we've got on them because it's their journey, not necessarily ours. And I suppose it's all about that term for me, empowerment. Are we empowering our teachers and our students to make those decisions in the way that they can to get the outcomes? And what I would probably encourage you to think about is your own data systems. So what I can see the future of education being is teachers put in all of this data And obviously the data is done in a way where there's that standardisation. So, for example, because there has to be a common denominator for data to actually be coherent. So all schools will have subjects where they mark the students from 1 to 4, for example, or 1 to 5. And some of the best schools have actually been in as well. Let's just say a student gets a 2 in an assessment out of 5. We know that's not where they should be. They should be working at a 3, for example. In the MIS, I will say, this is what I'm doing. This is the intervention I'm putting in place because of this number. This is the retest we had at the end of this intervention period. This is how much they improved by. And so when Ofsted comes in and they say, okay, so, and I've been there in these meetings, they'll ask what interventions have you put in place, and you'll say, okay, X, Y, and Z. And then sometimes the question will come, how do you know this intervention worked? And I've been there where teachers will just suddenly go, that is a good question, because it is. Do we have the data to actually support the effectiveness of that intervention? And is that for all students? Because having that, rather, in staff CPD, you can sit at the regular occurrences at terminally and you'll say, okay, so as a school, here is a spreadsheet of all of the interventions that we've done, and these are the top 10. These are what work across the whole curriculum. So if you're struggling because you don't know quite what's going to work for Johnny, have you tried all of these 10? Because for me, one of the challenges which I think as teachers can get quite isolated, especially in subjects which are quite nuanced, like design and technology, for example, food technology, there isn't that collegiate approach where I can understand subjects in a way where perhaps other subjects allow them to do, and I'll explain that. So one of the things which I really valued is having that data to say, this is happening in English, this is happening in maths, this is happening in history, and the impact is profound. And that intervention strategy, I might go, wow, I never thought of that. Good God. And it works. And instead, I can get quite repetitive in my own intervention strategies because over time, this is what I've acquired. And I think that discussion is really impactful, especially when it's coupled with the data. And when Ofsted come in and you talk about these are the interventions we've done and this is the impact it's having, Ofsted are going to be blown away. And when we look at the new Ofsted framework, and I've been discussing this with quite a few school leaders and trust leaders, and I don't know what your opinion is of the new framework, but it seems to me to be more evidence. Ofsted are looking for more evidence. They're kind of looking as to what works and why does it work. Obviously, they're already looking at AI, and I've already said how AI can help. And if you want anything support-wise from Telfin or Rican or myself, talk to us. And we've already delivered quite a few AI packages to different schools. Please let us know if you're interested in this, as well as MIS support as well. Whether it's ARBIS, SIMS, Bromcom, they will all do the data analysis. It's just a matter of, for me, I'd encourage you to change your mindset away from that the macro level to a micro. Let's get as much data as we can. In my opinion, and I've done statistical analysis, as well as computer science, so I am a bit of a nerd with maths, but as you can tell probably. But for me, no data is useless. Data always tells a story. If a kid has a bad day and does it poorly on a test, it doesn't mean you don't put it in. Actually, they might have a crisis at home, and that will enable me to understand why they've got this test. It allows me to uncover things and trajectories and paths which otherwise might be hidden. And when Ofsted comes in, from my experience, the better we know our students in terms of them and their journey, the better Ofsted responds in terms of understanding why data is the way it is. And when we really want to show Ofsted how well do we know our students, they can see that in the classroom, of course, but it's also data. If this student is underperforming, how can you make sure that they're making that progress? And that's always been the ultimate question, time after time. It hasn't changed in a decade. But I think with AI and data analysis and the way it is now, I think we can actually really create a pedagogical approach which reduces that teacher workload and maximises student outcomes. So please let me know your thoughts on my thoughts. And obviously there'll be quite a few other episodes about this, but really I just wanted to talk. I was thinking about this earlier today and I just wanted to share what my thoughts were. And for me, I think if schools really invested in this micro level approach, I think it would transform education, really. I think schools will see teachers happier, they'll understand their students and the curriculum far better. And I think moving forward, it's not about increasing that workload with having data everywhere, left, right, and centre, because it does need to be purposeful. But there needs to be that happy medium, doesn't there, about making sure we have as much data as we possibly can, whilst making sure it's meaningful and teacher workload is also reduced. So send me a message. Let me know your thoughts. But otherwise, thank you for watching and thank you for listening.